Imagine discovering that the sweet grandmother who bakes cookies for the neighborhood bake sale, who waters her roses every morning with a gentle smile, was once one of the most lethal assassins in Cold War history. This isn't fiction. This is the story of a woman who eliminated high-value targets across 3 continents, who was trained to kill with her bare hands, who speaks 6 languages fluently, and who vanished from Soviet intelligence records in 1982 only to resurface as Margaret Thompson, a beloved member of a quiet American community. For over 40 years she lived among us, completely invisible, her past buried so deep that even her own children had no idea who their mother truly was. But secrets this dark never stay buried forever. When a former CIA operative moved into her neighborhood and recognized something others couldn't see, the carefully constructed walls of her double life began to crack. What drove this deadly woman to abandon everything she knew? What happened during those missing years between Moscow and Main Street? And most terrifying of all, when her past finally caught up with her, how did she manage to protect the family she built without revealing the blood on her hands? The answers will leave you questioning everything you think you know about the people living right next door to you. Margaret Thompson was exactly the kind of neighbor everyone wished they had. At 78 years old, she embodied everything warm and comforting about small-town American life in Asheville, North Carolina. Every Sunday morning, without fail, she attended the 9 o'clock service at Grove Park Baptist Church, sitting in the 3rd pew from the front, the same seat she had occupied for nearly 4 decades. Her silver hair was always perfectly styled in soft waves, and she wore floral dresses that seemed plucked from a Norman Rockwell painting. The modest 2-story colonial house she had shared with her late husband, Thomas, sat on a tree-lined street where the Blue Ridge Mountains provided a stunning backdrop to everyday life. The house itself told a story of a life well lived, with its white picket fence, immaculately maintained garden bursting with roses, hydrangeas and black-eyed Susans, and a front porch with 2 rocking chairs that creaked gently in the mountain breeze. Maggie, as everyone called her, had become something of a local treasure. She volunteered twice a week at the public library, reading stories to children with animated voices that brought every character to life. She organized the annual Christmas fundraiser for the local food bank. Her apple pies regularly won blue ribbons at the county fair. When the Johnson family down the street lost their father to cancer, Maggie showed up with casseroles and compassion, sitting with the widow late into the evening, holding her hand and listening. Her own family adored her. Her daughter Rachel, a high school teacher, lived 20 minutes away with her husband and 2 teenage children. Her son, Christopher, had moved to Charlotte for work, but called every Tuesday evening like clockwork. The grandchildren, Emma and Jacob, spent countless summer afternoons in Maggie's kitchen, learning to bake bread and listening to stories about their grandfather Thomas, the kind university professor who had passed away 5 years earlier from a heart attack. To everyone who knew her, Margaret Thompson represented the best of what a life could be. Devoted wife, loving mother, doting grandmother, faithful friend, and active community member. Her accent carried just the faintest hint of something unplaceable, which she explained away with a story about being raised by European immigrants who moved frequently during her childhood. It was a detail so minor that nobody ever thought twice about it. But in the autumn of 2023, everything began to shift when David Chen moved into the grey Cape Cod house directly across the street. At 65, Chen was recently retired, or so he told the neighbors who welcomed him with homemade cookies and offers to help with the move. He was pleasant but private, mentioning only that he had worked for the government and was looking for a quiet place to spend his golden years. The first time David Chen saw Margaret Thompson watering her roses on a crisp October morning, he noticed something that made him freeze mid-step. It wasn't anything obvious. To anyone else, she was simply an elderly woman in a gardening apron, humming softly to herself as she tended her flowers. But Chen had spent 33 years with the CIA, 12 of those years dedicated to identifying and tracking Soviet intelligence operatives. He had been trained to see what others missed. It was the way she held the watering can, he realized later. The grip was too precise, too controlled. It was the way she scanned the street before stepping off her porch, a movement so subtle and so ingrained that she probably didn't even know she was doing it anymore. It was the way her eyes tracked the UPS truck as it drove past, noting the driver, the route, the timing. Most telling of all was what happened when their eyes met for the first time. For just a fraction of a second, less than a heartbeat, Margaret Thompson's expression changed. It wasn't fear exactly, but recognition. The recognition of one professional spotting another. Then just as quickly it was gone, replaced by the warm, grandmotherly smile she had perfected over decades. Chen smiled back and waved. She waved in return and called out, "Welcome to the neighborhood. I'll have to bring you some of my famous apple pie." Her voice was cheerful, her demeanor completely natural. But David Chen knew, and somewhere deep in her carefully guarded consciousness, Margaret Thompson knew that he knew. Over the following weeks, Chen watched. Not obviously, not in a way that would alarm her or the other neighbors, but with the patient observation skills that had made him one of the CIA's most effective field agents. He noticed how Margaret's morning routines varied just slightly each day, never following an exact pattern that could be predicted or exploited. He noticed how she positioned herself at community gatherings, always with clear sightlines to exits, never with her back exposed to open spaces. He watched her hands. They moved with an efficiency and grace that spoke of decades of muscle memory training. When she opened her car door, when she carried grocery bags, when she pruned her roses with those sharp garden shears, there was something in the economy of motion that whispered of a very different kind of training than homemaking and grandmothering. Chen began spending time at the library when Margaret volunteered there. He attended the same church services. He struck up conversations at the local coffee shop where she met friends for lunch. All the while, he gathered data, cross-referencing his observations with memories from his years studying Soviet intelligence operations and the faces he had committed to memory during countless briefings. It took him 6 weeks to be certain, 6 weeks of careful analysis, of digging through old classified files he still had access to through his contacts, of comparing aged photographs with the woman who lived across the street. When he finally confirmed his suspicion, David Chen sat alone in his study, staring at a grainy black-and-white photograph from 1978 that showed a beautiful young woman in East Berlin, captured by a CIA surveillance camera during an operation that had ended with 3 NATO intelligence assets dead. The woman in that photograph was named Margarita Volkov. She had been a ghost, a legend whispered about in intelligence circles, a KGB operative so skilled and so deadly that she had disappeared from all records after 1982. The CIA had assumed she was dead, eliminated by her own people during one of the many purges, or perhaps killed during a mission gone wrong. But Margarita Volkov wasn't dead. She was living on Magnolia Street in Asheville, North Carolina, baking pies and reading children's books at the public library. The question that kept Chen awake at night was simple. What should he do with this information? And more importantly, why had the KGB's most lethal female operative abandoned her mission to become an American grandmother? Margaret Thompson lay awake in her own bed that same night, 300 feet across the street. She had known from the moment David Chen arrived that her carefully constructed life was in danger. She had recognized him too, though she couldn't place exactly where or when. But she knew the type. She knew the walk, the awareness, the training that never quite faded, no matter how many years passed. For 41 years, she had lived with the constant low-grade fear that one day her past would find her. She had built contingency plans, exit strategies, false identities that could be activated within hours. But now, lying in the darkness of her bedroom, surrounded by photos of her children and grandchildren, she realized something had changed. She was too old to run. More than that, she no longer wanted to run. This life, this family, this community, they were real. They were hers. And she would do whatever was necessary to protect them, even if it meant confronting the past she had spent 4 decades trying to forget. The next morning, Margaret Thompson baked an apple pie, just as she had promised. She crossed the street carrying it on a china plate, her smile warm and genuine, and knocked on David Chen's door. When he opened it, their eyes met, and in that moment, 2 former Cold Warriors stood facing each other on a peaceful suburban street, both knowing that the carefully maintained illusions were about to shatter. "I thought you might enjoy some homemade pie," Margaret said sweetly, her voice carrying just enough warmth to sound completely natural. I hope you like apple. It's an old family recipe." Chen took the plate, noting how steady her hands were, how calm her breathing remained. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Thompson. Please come in. I've been hoping we might have a chance to talk." As Margaret stepped across the threshold into her neighbor's home, she knew that the conversation they were about to have would determine whether she could protect the life she had built, or whether everything she loved would be destroyed by the truth of who she had once been. Now, if you want to discover how this dangerous confrontation unfolds, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Hit that like button, drop a comment below telling us what you think so far, and share this video with anyone who loves incredible stories. Because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about Margaret Thompson. The secrets about to be revealed go deeper and darker than anyone could imagine. To understand who Margaret Thompson had become, we must first understand who Margarita Volkov was. And that story begins in Moscow, in the brutal winter of 1965, when a 19-year-old girl with exceptional grades and an unremarkable background was summoned to an address that didn't officially exist. Margarita had been born in 1946, in the aftermath of the Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets called World War II. Her father had been a mid-level party official, loyal and competent, but never important enough to be particularly wealthy or powerful. Her mother taught mathematics at a local school. They lived in a modest apartment in one of Moscow's newer districts, where the buildings were grey concrete blocks that all looked the same, and life moved to the rhythm of quotas, ration cards, and the ever-present awareness that walls had ears. From early childhood, Margarita had been different. She learned to read at 4, taught herself English from discarded books she found at the library by age 8, and added German and French by 12. She had a photographic memory that allowed her to recall entire pages of text after reading them once. Her mathematics teacher told her mother that Margarita had the kind of mind that could reshape Soviet science if properly cultivated. But it wasn't her academic brilliance that caught the attention of the KGB. It was something far more unusual. During her mandatory Komsomol training, the Communist Youth Organization, an instructor had noticed that Margarita possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people. She could detect lies with uncanny accuracy. She understood social dynamics intuitively, knowing exactly what to say and when to say it to achieve her desired outcome. She could adapt her personality like a chameleon, becoming whoever she needed to be in any given situation. Most striking of all, she showed absolutely no emotional response to violence. When the Komsomol group had been taken to watch a public execution, a standard practice meant to reinforce loyalty to the state, the other young people had looked away or shown visible distress. Margarita had watched with calm analytical detachment, as though she were studying a scientific demonstration. The instructor's report had made its way through channels, and in February 1965, Margarita received a letter instructing her to appear at a specific address at precisely 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. The letter provided no explanation. It didn't need to. In the Soviet Union, when you were summoned, you went. The building was unmarked, located in a part of Moscow that tourists never saw. Margarita was led through corridors that smelled of cigarette smoke and floor polish, past offices where men in uniform studied maps and documents, until she reached a small room with no windows. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling. A man in his 50s, with steel-grey hair and eyes that held no warmth whatsoever, sat behind a metal desk. "Sit down, Comrade Volkov," he said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone who was never questioned. "My name is Colonel Petrov. We have been watching you for some time. You have certain qualities that could be of great value to the motherland." What followed was 3 hours of the most intensive psychological evaluation Margarita had ever experienced. Petrov asked questions that seemed designed to trap her, to reveal weaknesses or disloyalty. He showed her photographs of violence and death, watching her reactions. He described scenarios and asked her to solve them, complex problems that had no clear right answer. At the end, Colonel Petrov leaned back in his chair and lit a cigarette. "You feel nothing when you look at these images. Why is that?" Margarita had learned early in life that honesty was usually the best strategy when dealing with the state, unless the state wanted you to lie. "I understand that people die," she said simply. "I understand that the motherland must sometimes do difficult things to protect itself. Emotional reactions do not change reality. They only cloud judgment. Petrov smiled for the first time. It was not a pleasant smile. Exactly correct. You are going to receive training, Comrade Volkov. Special training. If you succeed, you will serve the Soviet Union in ways that will never be publicly acknowledged, but will be absolutely essential to our survival. If you fail or if you attempt to refuse this opportunity, you will disappear and your family will never know what happened to you. Do you understand? I understand, Comrade Colonel. Good. Report to this address tomorrow at dawn. Bring nothing with you. Your old life is over. The training facility was located in a forest 200 kilometers from Moscow. It looked like a small village from the outside, complete with houses, shops, and even a church. But it was all a facade, a practice ground for operatives learning to blend into Western society. Margarita was one of 12 recruits, all young, all possessing unusual aptitudes that had caught the KGB's attention. The training was brutal beyond anything she could have imagined. They were taught hand-to-hand combat by instructors who showed no mercy, leaving them bruised and bleeding on the practice mats. They learned weapons, not just how to shoot, but how to kill silently with knives, wire, poison, and improvised tools. They studied psychology, learning to manipulate people's fears, desires, and weaknesses. They were taught surveillance and counter-surveillance, how to follow someone without being detected, and how to know when they were being followed. They learned to pick locks, crack safes, plant bugs, and photograph documents in seconds. They studied Western culture obsessively, watching American and European films, reading magazines, learning to dress and speak and think like the enemy. But the hardest part of the training wasn't physical or technical. It was the systematic destruction of identity. They were taught to become blank slates, to suppress their own personalities and emotions so completely that they could assume any role required of them. They were forced to betray each other in exercises, to lie to people they had bonded with, to watch their fellow recruits be punished for failures without showing any reaction. Of the 12 who started the program, only 5 completed it. 3 were dismissed for psychological unsuitability. 2 died during training exercises. 1 simply vanished one night, and the remaining recruits were told never to speak of her again. The message was clear. Failure was not an option, and loyalty to the mission outweighed everything else, including life itself. Margarita excelled. She discovered that she had a natural talent for violence, a coldness that allowed her to do whatever was necessary without hesitation or regret. Her linguistic abilities and photographic memory made her perfect for deep cover work. By the time she completed her training in 1967, at age 21, she had been transformed into something that was no longer quite human. Her first mission took her to Prague during the period of liberalization that would later be crushed by Soviet tanks in 1968. She posed as a university student, befriended a Czech journalist who was publishing articles critical of Soviet policy, and poisoned him with a substance that caused what appeared to be a fatal heart attack. She was back in Moscow within 48 hours, her mission accomplished with such perfection that no one ever suspected anything other than a tragic natural death. Over the next 15 years, Margarita Volkov became one of the KGB's most valuable assets. She operated across Eastern Europe, occasionally penetrating into Western Europe on short-term missions. She eliminated targets that threatened Soviet interests, recruited sources who provided valuable intelligence, and operated with such skill that Western intelligence agencies knew she existed but could never identify her with certainty. She was known in CIA briefings only as the Sparrow, a codename derived from the few eyewitness accounts that described a beautiful, dark-haired woman seen near locations where suspicious deaths occurred. But the Sparrow left no fingerprints, no photographs, no evidence. She was a ghost who moved through the shadows of the Cold War, leaving only bodies and mysteries in her wake. Margarita lived in Moscow between missions, in a better apartment now, with privileges that came from her service. She had no husband, no children, no real friends. The KGB was her family. The missions were her purpose. She told herself that she was serving the motherland, protecting the Soviet people from Western aggression and capitalist exploitation. But somewhere deep inside, in a place she tried never to examine, Margarita was beginning to feel something she had never experienced before: emptiness. The missions that had once given her life meaning now felt mechanical, repetitive. The constant deception, the lies, the killing, they were hollowing her out, leaving nothing behind but the perfect facade she showed to the world. In 1982, Colonel Petrov, now a general, called her to his office for a new assignment. "You are going to America," he told her. "This will be a long-term mission, perhaps years. You will establish a deep cover identity, integrate into American society, and wait for activation orders. This is the most important assignment you have ever received." Margarita accepted without hesitation. She had never questioned an order. She had never failed a mission. She was the perfect Soviet operative. But what General Petrov didn't know, what nobody in the KGB could have predicted, was that sending Margarita Volkov to America would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the greatest betrayal in her operational history. What do you think about Margarita's journey so far? Can someone who has been trained to kill without emotion ever truly become human again? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Margarita Volkov arrived in New York City on September 15, 1982, carrying a Canadian passport that identified her as Margaret Ann Sullivan, age 34, born in Toronto to Irish immigrant parents who had both died in a car accident 10 years earlier. The identity was bulletproof. The KGB had spent 2 years building it, creating a complete paper trail that would withstand even intensive scrutiny. The legend, as intelligence agencies called false identities, was perfect in its ordinariness. Margaret Sullivan had attended university in Toronto, studying English literature. She had worked as a secretary for various companies, moving frequently, which explained why she had few long-term connections. She had never married, had no living relatives, and was relocating to the United States to start fresh after a failed engagement. It was the kind of unremarkable story that made people sympathetic without making them curious. Margarita spent her first 3 months in America simply learning to be American. She rented a small apartment in Queens, got a job as an administrative assistant at a mid-sized accounting firm, and immersed herself in the rhythms of American life. She watched television obsessively, absorbing the culture, the humor, the casual interactions that were so different from Soviet society. She went to movies, shopped at grocery stores, learned to navigate the subway, and practiced thinking in English rather than translating from Russian. The KGB had provided her with a handler, a man who posed as a businessman, and met with her once a month in various locations around the city. Her instructions were simple: establish herself as a legitimate American resident, build a normal life, and wait. She had no specific mission yet. She was what intelligence agencies called a sleeper, an asset positioned in place for future activation when the need arose. But living in America, truly living in it rather than just operating in it, began to change something fundamental in Margarita. For the first time in her life, she experienced personal freedom. She could walk down the street without showing papers. She could buy whatever she wanted without ration cards or connections. She could have conversations with strangers without wondering if they were informants. The weight of constant surveillance and fear that had defined life in the Soviet Union was absent here. More troubling to her sense of identity, she began to see the lies she had been told about American life. The propaganda had painted America as a nation of poverty and exploitation, where the working class suffered under capitalist oppression. What she found instead was a complex society with its own problems, certainly, but also with opportunities and freedoms that simply didn't exist in the Soviet Union. In March 1983, her handler gave her new instructions. She was to relocate to North Carolina and establish herself in the academic community. The KGB wanted assets positioned near universities where military research was being conducted. Asheville was identified as an ideal location, close to several institutions and with a community that welcomed newcomers. Margarita moved to Asheville in April 1983. She found an apartment, got a job as a secretary at the University of North Carolina, Asheville, and began the process of integrating into the community. The mountain air was clean and fresh, so different from Moscow's industrial haze. The people were friendly in a way that seemed genuine rather than performative. She joined a church because it was expected, volunteered at local events, and gradually became a familiar face around town. It was at a faculty mixer in September 1983 that she met Professor Thomas Thompson. He was 42, a widower whose wife had died of cancer 3 years earlier, leaving him to raise their 10-year-old daughter, Rachel, alone. He taught American literature and was known on campus as a kind, somewhat absent-minded academic who loved books more than he loved departmental politics. Margarita had been trained to identify and exploit vulnerabilities. She recognized immediately that Thomas Thompson was lonely, still grieving, and desperate for intellectual connection. He would be easy to manipulate, potentially useful as a source of information or access. She engineered a conversation about Hemingway, pretending to be less knowledgeable than she was, asking questions that made him eager to explain and educate. What she didn't anticipate was that she would actually enjoy the conversation. Thomas was genuinely intelligent, passionate about literature in a way that was infectious and utterly without guile. When he asked if she would like to have coffee sometime to continue their discussion, she said yes, telling herself it was operational necessity. Over the following months, coffee became dinner. Dinner became walks through the autumn leaves in the mountains, and walks became something that Margarita had never experienced in her 37 years. A real relationship. Thomas had no idea she was anything other than Margaret Sullivan, a quiet woman with a mysterious past who seemed to understand him in ways that few people did. For the first time since her training had stripped away her humanity, Margarita felt something beyond the cold calculation that had defined her existence. She found herself laughing at Thomas's terrible jokes. She felt protective of his daughter, Rachel, who was wary of her father's new friend, but gradually warmed to the woman who helped her with homework and listened to her teenage anxieties without judgment. This was not part of the mission. This was dangerous. Emotional attachments made operatives vulnerable, compromised their judgment, created weaknesses that could be exploited. Margarita told herself repeatedly that she needed to end this, to keep Thomas at a professional distance, to remember who she was and what she was there to do. But she didn't end it. Instead, she fell deeper into the lie that was becoming the truth. When Thomas proposed in June 1984, Margarita knew she should refuse. She knew she should report the situation to her handler and request reassignment. She knew that every intelligence protocol she had ever learned demanded that she extract herself immediately. Instead, she said yes. The wedding was small, just close friends and family. Margarita wore a simple white dress. Rachel served as the flower girl, smiling now, having accepted Margaret as her new stepmother. Standing at the altar in that little church in Asheville, repeating vows that should have been just another layer of deep cover, Margarita made a decision that would change everything. She decided to desert. She didn't tell Thomas, of course. She couldn't. But after the wedding, when her handler contacted her for their regular meeting, Margarita didn't show up. She didn't return to any of the dead drop locations where she would check for messages. She simply vanished from the KGB's operational network, going completely dark in intelligence terminology. She knew what this meant. Deserters were hunted. Deserters were eliminated, usually in ways that sent a message to other operatives about the consequences of betrayal. She had participated in such eliminations herself. She knew exactly what the KGB did to people who betrayed them. But Margarita, who was truly becoming Margaret now, made a calculated gamble. The KGB didn't know her real location. Her handler had only known she was in North Carolina, not specifically where. Her new identity as Margaret Thompson, married to an American citizen, would be difficult to trace. If she simply stopped being Margarita Volkov, if she buried that identity so deep that it ceased to exist, perhaps she could survive. More than that, perhaps she could actually live. The first year of her marriage was the most terrifying of her life. Every stranger on the street could be a KGB assassin. Every unexpected knock on the door could be the moment when her past caught up with her. She slept lightly, always aware of exits, always prepared to run if necessary. But gradually, as months became years, the fear lessened. The KGB never came. Margaret began to believe that perhaps she had succeeded in disappearing. Perhaps they had written her off as dead, killed during her deep cover mission. Perhaps the chaos of the mid-1980s Soviet Union, with leadership changes and restructuring, had simply caused her file to be lost in bureaucratic confusion. Margaret gave birth to a son, Christopher, in 1986. She raised Rachel as her own daughter, attending school plays and helping with college applications. She learned to bake pies and tend a garden. She made friends with neighbors who knew nothing about East Berlin or Prague or the people she had killed in the name of the motherland. Thomas never suspected. How could he? She was the perfect wife, intelligent and cultured, with a mysterious but romantic past that he never pushed her to fully explain. He loved her completely, and Margaret, in a way that still surprised her, loved him back. But the past never truly dies. It only waits. And for 41 years, Margaret Thompson lived with the knowledge that one day the knock on the door would finally come. Thank you so much for staying with us through this incredible journey. We know this is a long story, but trust us, the most dramatic revelations are still ahead. What happens when Margaret's carefully protected life collides with the truth? Stay tuned, because the next chapter will show you exactly how she managed to hide in plain sight for 4 decades. The years passed in Asheville with a normalcy that Margaret had never imagined possible. The 1980s became the 1990s. The Cold War ended. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed. Margaret watched these world-changing events on television with mixed emotions. The nation she had served, the system she had killed for, simply ceased to exist. She wondered sometimes about the people she had known in Moscow. Colonel Petrov was almost certainly dead by now. Her training cohort, the few who had survived, were they still alive? Had they adapted to the new Russia, or had they been discarded like obsolete weapons when the KGB was dissolved and reformed into new intelligence services? Margaret had no way of knowing, and she couldn't risk trying to find out. She had made her choice in 1984, and she lived with it every single day. The price of her new life was eternal vigilance and complete silence about who she had been. Thomas never knew. In 1995, when he was diagnosed with heart disease, Margaret nursed him through 2 surgeries and years of medication management. She held his hand through the fear and pain, and never once did he suspect that those hands had killed people in ways that would have horrified him. When he looked at her, he saw only Margaret, his beloved wife, the woman who had made his life complete after years of loneliness. Rachel grew up and became a teacher, following in her father's footsteps in her own way. She married a good man named Michael, and they gave Margaret grandchildren, Emma and Jacob. Margaret threw herself into grandmothering with an intensity that surprised even her. These children represented something pure, something untainted by her past. She could give them love without deception, even if they could never know the full truth of who she was. Christopher, her biological son, became a software engineer. He was brilliant, driven, and so thoroughly American that Margaret sometimes had to hide her smile at how completely different he was from anything the Soviet system would have produced. He was independent, entrepreneurial, skeptical of authority, everything that Margarita Volkov had been trained to destroy. Margaret built her life carefully, layer by layer, creating a structure so solid that she almost believed in it herself. She established routines, but varied them slightly to avoid predictability. She maintained awareness of her surroundings without being obvious about it. She kept herself physically fit, not in a way that would seem unusual for a health-conscious woman, but enough that she could still move quickly if she ever needed to. She never kept souvenirs from her past. There were no hidden documents, no photos, no weapons, nothing that could connect Margaret Thompson to Margarita Volkov. She had destroyed or abandoned everything when she deserted. The only evidence of her former life existed in classified files, thousands of miles away, and in her own memories. Those memories never faded. The faces of the people she had killed remained vivid and clear. She didn't feel guilt exactly. She had been trained too thoroughly for that. But she felt a kind of weight, an acknowledgement that she had done things that could never be undone or forgiven. She carried that weight silently, never sharing it, never letting it show. The years brought news that sometimes made her blood run cold. In 1993, a former KGB agent was found dead in London, poisoned in a way that bore the signature of Russian intelligence services. In 2006, another defector died in a similar manner. The message was clear. Russia might be different now, but it had a long memory for betrayal. Margaret followed these cases closely, always wondering if her turn would come. But it never did. She began to develop theories about why she had been spared. Perhaps her deep cover had been so complete that when she vanished, the KGB had simply assumed she had been killed by American counterintelligence. Perhaps her case file had been lost during the chaos of the Soviet collapse. Perhaps someone who knew the truth had decided to let her disappear, a professional courtesy between old warriors. Or perhaps they were still looking, and they simply hadn't found her yet. The only person who ever came close to the truth was Thomas, and even he never quite got there. In 2003, watching a documentary about Cold War espionage, he had turned to Margaret with a thoughtful expression and said, "You know, I've never really understood your past. You've told me about growing up in Canada, but you've always been so vague about details. Sometimes I wonder if there's more to your story than you've shared." Margaret's heart had hammered in her chest, but her face remained perfectly calm. "Everyone has parts of their past they'd rather not discuss," she said gently. "My childhood wasn't particularly happy. Coming to America, meeting you, building this life, that's when my real story began. Does it matter so much what came before?" Thomas had taken her hand. "No," he said. "I suppose it doesn't. I love who you are, Margaret. That's all that matters." She had held on to that moment, treasured it, because it represented everything she had gained by choosing this life. Thomas loved her. Her children loved her. She had friends, a community, a purpose that didn't involve violence or deception. She had become, in a very real sense, the person she pretended to be. When Thomas died in 2018, Margaret grieved genuinely and deeply. He had been her anchor, the first person who had ever seen value in her beyond her usefulness as a weapon. At his funeral, surrounded by people whose lives he had touched through his teaching and kindness, Margaret had felt the full weight of her deception. All these people were mourning a good man, never knowing that his wife had been a Soviet assassin. She wondered in her darkest moments what Thomas would have thought if he had known the truth. Would he have still loved her? Could he have accepted that the woman who had shared his bed for 34 years had taken lives before she ever took his hand? Or would the truth have destroyed everything they had built together? Margaret would never know, and in a way, that was its own form of mercy. After Thomas's death, Margaret continued her routines. She stayed active in the community, spent time with her grandchildren, maintained her home and garden. She was 72 years old, and to everyone around her, she was simply a widow adjusting to life alone, making the best of her remaining years with grace and dignity. But alone in her house at night, Margaret sometimes allowed herself to remember. She would sit in the darkness of her bedroom, looking at photos of her family, and acknowledge the incredible improbability of what she had accomplished. She had escaped the KGB. She had built a life in enemy territory. She had loved and been loved in return. She had raised children who would never know violence or fear or the constant weight of surveillance. Against all odds, Margarita Volkov had found redemption by becoming Margaret Thompson. And then, in the autumn of 2023, David Chen moved in across the street, and Margaret knew that the 41 years of silence were about to end. We're almost at the end of this incredible journey, but the most crucial moments are just ahead. If you've made it this far, it means you're truly invested in Margaret's story. Don't leave now. Stay until the very end to discover how everything resolves. And if you're enjoying this, please subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. We have many more extraordinary stories coming your way that you won't want to miss. The final chapter will reveal secrets that will change everything you thought you knew. Margaret Thompson stood in David Chen's living room, the china plate with apple pie still in her hands, as two former intelligence operatives sized each other up like chess players studying a board. The house was sparsely furnished, the temporary look of someone who had recently moved in, but Margaret's trained eye caught the details that mattered. No family photos, minimal personal items, clear sightlines to all entrances. This was the home of a man who still lived like an operative, even in retirement. Chen gestured to a chair. "Please sit down, Mrs. Thompson, or should I say Comrade Volkov?" Margaret remained standing, her posture relaxed but ready. "I haven't been called that name in 41 years, Mr. Chen, and I suspect you know exactly why." "I do," Chen admitted. "I've spent the last 6 weeks confirming what I suspected the moment I saw you. The CIA believed you were dead. We had reports from 1985 suggesting you'd been eliminated during a mission in West Germany. Apparently, those reports were either wrong or intentionally misleading. The latter, Margaret said quietly. The KGB couldn't acknowledge that one of their top operatives had deserted. Better to declare me dead and close the file. Saved them the embarrassment and saved me from active pursuit. At least, that's what I've always hoped. Chen studied her face, seeing past the elderly features to the legendary operative beneath. The Sparrow. You were responsible for at least 17 confirmed eliminations, possibly more that we never attributed to you. You operated across Eastern and Western Europe for 15 years, and then you just vanished. Margaret finally set down the pie plate and took a seat, her movements graceful despite her age. I made a choice, Mr. Chen. I chose life over death. I chose love over loyalty to a system that had turned me into a weapon. I'm not asking for forgiveness, and I'm not claiming I deserve it. But I am asking you what you intend to do with this information. That's what I've been trying to figure out, Chen said, sitting down across from her. Technically, you're still wanted for crimes committed during the Cold War. There are families of people you killed who never got justice. There are intelligence agencies that would very much like to debrief you about your operations and your knowledge of KGB procedures. And yet you haven't reported me, Margaret observed. You've been watching me for 6 weeks, confirming your suspicions, and you haven't made a single phone call to your former colleagues. Why? Chen leaned back in his chair, a wry smile crossing his face. Because I'm not sure what the point would be. The Cold War ended 30 years ago. The Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. You've been living as an American citizen for 4 decades, raising a family, contributing to your community. What exactly would prosecuting a 78-year-old grandmother accomplish? It would be justice for the people I killed, Margaret said quietly. Don't minimize that, Mr. Chen. I don't. No, I can see that you don't, Chen replied, his tone softening slightly. But here's what I've observed over the past 6 weeks. I've watched you volunteer at the library, reading to children who light up when they see you. I've seen you organize food drives for families struggling to make ends meet. I've watched you spend hours on the phone with your daughter, giving her advice about her own children. I've seen the way your neighbors look at you, with genuine affection and respect. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I've spent 33 years fighting the Cold War, Mrs. Thompson. I've seen what happens when we let the past consume the present. And I've reached a point in my life where I'm trying to understand what justice actually means. Is it punishment for crimes committed under a regime that no longer exists? Or is it acknowledging that people can change, that redemption is possible even for those who have done terrible things? Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, hope mixed with profound vulnerability. I can't change what I did, she said. Those people are still dead because of me. But I can tell you that when I chose to leave that life behind, I didn't just walk away. I spent every day since then trying to be worthy of the gift I gave myself, the gift of becoming someone different. Tell me about Thomas, Chen said suddenly. Did he know? Never, Margaret replied, her voice carrying the weight of 41 years of deception. He died thinking I was exactly who I claimed to be. Sometimes I wonder if that makes me a monster, lying to him for our entire marriage. But I also know that telling him would have destroyed him. The truth would have poisoned everything good we built together. And your children? Your grandchildren? Margaret's hands tightened slightly in her lap. They know nothing. Rachel isn't even my biological daughter, but she calls me Mom and has never questioned my love for her. Christopher, my son, he's so American he can barely locate Russia on a map. Emma and Jacob, my grandchildren, they think their grandmother's most exciting adventure was winning a blue ribbon at the county fair for her apple pie. And you want to keep it that way, Chen said. It wasn't a question. More than anything, Margaret admitted. Not because I'm ashamed of facing consequences for what I did, but because they don't deserve to have their lives torn apart by my past. They're innocent, Mr. Chen. Completely innocent. And I've spent 4 decades protecting that innocence. Chen stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street, at Margaret's house across the road with its perfect lawn and flower garden. I've been thinking about something, he said. The Cold War produced countless casualties. Some of them died in combat, Some of them were executed as spies, but some of them just vanished, disappeared into new lives, trying to escape the machinery of states that ground up human beings and spit out weapons. He turned back to face her. I think you were a casualty too, Mrs. Thompson, a different kind of casualty, but a victim nonetheless of a system that took a 19-year-old girl and turned her into an assassin. That doesn't absolve you of responsibility for your actions, but it does provide context. What are you saying? Margaret asked carefully. I'm saying that I'm an old man who has seen too much death and too much suffering to want to add to it unnecessarily. I'm saying that the world has moved on from the Cold War, and maybe it's time we let some ghosts rest. I'm saying that Margaret Thompson, grandmother and community volunteer, is not the same person as Margarita Volkov, KGB operative, and I see no benefit to dragging one forward to destroy the other. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes, the first real tears she had shed in decades. You're going to let me keep my life? On one condition, Chen said firmly. You tell them. Not everything, God knows they don't need every detail, but your children deserve to know some version of the truth, not because I'm demanding it, but because secrets like this have a way of emerging at the worst possible times. Better that it comes from you, framed in your own words, than from some investigation or journalist down the road. Margaret's mind raced. The thought of revealing even part of her past to Rachel and Christopher terrified her more than any mission she had ever undertaken. But Chen was right. The secret was too big, too dangerous. If she died without telling them, and the truth emerged later, they would never understand, never forgive, never have the chance to process it with her guidance. I'll tell them, she said quietly. Not everything, but enough. Enough that they understand who I was and who I chose to become. Chen nodded. That's all I ask. And Mrs. Thompson, for what it's worth, I think you made the right choice in 1984. The world didn't need another Soviet operative, but it did need more people who chose love over ideology, family over duty, peace over violence. Thank you, Margaret said, standing. I never expected understanding, certainly not from someone who spent his career fighting against people like me. We were all pawns in someone else's game, Chen replied. The least we can do now is show each other some humanity. Margaret left his house carrying the untouched apple pie, walked across the street, and stood in her own living room for a long time, gathering the courage for the most difficult mission of her life. 3 days later, Margaret invited Rachel and Christopher to dinner. She cooked Thomas's favorite meal, pot roast with all the fixings, as if channeling his presence for strength. After dinner, as they sat in the living room with coffee, Margaret took a deep breath and began to speak. There's something I need to tell you both. Something I should have told you a long time ago, but I was too afraid of losing you. Rachel and Christopher exchanged worried glances. Mom, are you sick? Rachel asked. No, sweetheart. I'm healthy. But my past isn't what I've told you. I haven't been completely honest about where I came from or who I was before I met your father. Over the next hour, Margaret told them a carefully edited version of her story. She explained that she had been born in the Soviet Union, that she had worked for the government in ways she couldn't fully detail, and that she had been sent to America on an assignment. She told them about meeting Thomas, about falling in love, about making the decision to leave her old life behind and build something real. She didn't tell them about the people she had killed. She didn't describe her training or her missions. She framed it as intelligence work, analysis and information gathering, not assassination. It was still a lie, but it was a lie designed to protect them from the worst truths while giving them the essential reality. Their mother had lived a completely different life before becoming their mother. Rachel cried. Christopher looked stunned. There were questions, so many questions, some that Margaret could answer, and some that she deflected as still being classified or too painful to discuss. But as the evening wore on, something remarkable happened. I can't imagine how scared you must have been, Rachel said, holding her mother's hand, leaving everything you knew, risking your life to be with Dad. That's incredibly brave. You gave up everything for love, Christopher added, his voice thick with emotion. For a chance at a normal life, that's something I can understand and respect. They didn't know everything. They would never know everything. But they knew enough to understand that Margaret Thompson had been forged from someone else, someone who had made a choice that had allowed them to exist. And in that knowledge, there was acceptance. Over the following weeks, Margaret's relationship with her children deepened in unexpected ways. The secret that had always existed between them, invisible but present, was now acknowledged and understood. They asked questions occasionally, and Margaret answered when she could. They didn't judge her, they loved her, and that love was now built on a more honest foundation. David Chen became a true friend, one of the few people in the world who knew the full truth and accepted it. They had coffee together sometimes, two old warriors who had fought on opposite sides of a conflict that no longer mattered, finding unexpected companionship in their shared history. On a warm spring evening in 2024, Margaret sat on her porch with Emma and Jacob, her grandchildren, now 15 and 17. They were helping her plant new roses in the garden, their hands dirty with soil, their laughter filling the air. "Grandma," Emma asked, "is it true that you used to live in Russia?" "A long time ago, sweetheart, before I came to America and met your grandfather." "That's so cool," Jacob said. "You've had such an interesting life." Margaret smiled, looking at these beautiful young people who represented everything good that had come from her impossible choice. "Yes," she said quietly, "I suppose I have. But the best part of my life started the day I chose to stay here, in this country, and build a family." "Do you miss Russia?" Emma asked. Margaret thought about Moscow, about the cold winters and the grey buildings, about the girl she had been who had known nothing but duty and violence. "No," she said honestly, "I don't miss it at all. Everything I love is right here." As the sun set over the Blue Ridge Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Margaret Thompson felt something she had never expected to feel: peace. She had lived two lives, one built on death and one built on love. She had made choices that could never be fully justified or forgiven. She had carried secrets that had weighed on her soul for decades. But she had also proven that redemption was possible, that people could change, that the past didn't have to define the future. She had been a weapon once, but she had become a grandmother, a friend, a contributor to her community. She had been Margarita Volkov, but she had earned the right to be Margaret Thompson, and in the end perhaps that was its own form of justice. Margaret Thompson's story forces us to confront difficult questions about identity, redemption, and the possibility of change. Can someone who has committed terrible acts ever truly atone for them? Does the good we do later in life balance against the harm we caused earlier? What do we owe to the past and what do we owe to the future? These are questions without easy answers, which is exactly what makes them worth thinking about. Now we want to hear from you. What do you think about Margaret's choices? Could you forgive someone you loved if you discovered they had hidden such a profound secret? Do you believe people can truly change, or are we forever defined by our worst actions? Share your thoughts in the comments below and tell us your name and what city and state you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the country and around the world. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the extraordinary tales we have coming your way. Hit that like button to let us know you want more content like this. And check out the video appearing on your screen right now for another incredible story that will keep you captivated from beginning to end. Thank you for joining us on this remarkable journey. Until next time, remember that everyone you meet has a story, and sometimes those stories are far more complex and surprising than we could ever imagine.